I'm Jackie Cohen-Roth, founder CEO of Cannabis MD. Welcome to another Cannabis MD video profile. The mission of Cannabis MD is to educate, build, and engage an ecosystem of medical cannabis patients, owner-operators, the ancillary service providers, and policy influencers to advance the needs of the medical cannabis industry, ultimately assuring safe access to medical cannabis as well as assuring quality patient care. So, as I speak to professionals in the industry, the goal is again to first educate and then we build and then we engage as ecosystem so that we all can benefit from the plant-based medicine that the cannabis plant provides. So on this video, I'm very excited to be hosting Alisia Ratliff. Alisia has a unique story in the cannabis industry as a scientist. She was initially very opposed to cannabis. We're going to be talking about that. And now is a medical cannabis patient herself. She's currently Chief Science Officer of Jersey Hemp, located off the northwest coast of France. Did my homework there, and a self-governing island. She's also CEO of her own consulting firm, Victus Capital Ventures, where the focus is to help investors and founders of new cannabis firms. So welcome to Cannabis MD video profile, Alisia.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I'm so excited to be here speaking with you. I feel as if, we have this relationship to where we can talk forever. So I am looking forward to just having a great conversation today.
Yeah, thank you. And terrific conversation that you have with colleagues in the industry for the Cannabis MD, Cannabis Science and Therapeutics Education Forum. So we have that accessed on Cannabis MD YouTube channel where find this video as well as others. So I am very, very interested in what shifted your mind from the opposition to medical cannabis to becoming a patient yourself.
Yeah, well, it definitely wasn't my fun-loving pothead husband. I definitely wanted to love it then, but I just couldn't get around it. So I would just say, I was definitely sheltered as a child, coming up, and there weren't a lot of things I was exposed to. So I did kind of take on the negative stigma of cannabis very early on, just not knowing what I didn't know. And then, once I kind of got into my career as a scientist, I started working in traditional laboratories and kind of moved into project management, I really found that I was just so unfulfilled, just jobbing it. I didn't like the 9 to 5 and doing the same thing every day. And I felt this hole where I just wasn't making an impact with my work. So I really started to dig and search and see what was it I was passionate about. And I remember coming across CNN's documentary, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, Weed, and it was a 4-part documentary that I was like, ooh, this looks kind of interesting. Why not? And I watched it. And he literally had parallels to how I felt about cannabis that were completely dispelled by data and science and all of this research that had been done. And, for me, being a scientist, everything lies in the data. So I was already just like, okay, I'm intrigued now. Now my interest is piqued because he has showed me data that I can actually go chew on and really kind of digest this. And so when I did, I started to look into it. And, Charlotte's story, Charlotte Figge, oh, God bless her soul. She really pioneered the way for CBD, her and her mother. And, when I look back at just all of the research, all of the hard work and effort as a mother that went into finding something to work for her child, my God, it just really opened up doors. It really opened up just this whole new world of science that I was so interested in getting into. So that's honestly what just kind of, started that shift in mindset before I just jumped right into the industry.
That's, I heard the word passion and maybe not literally heard the word, but as you're sharing your experience as well as data and the science, and that if it presents itself and it's there, it just, it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
For myself is undergraduate degrees in policy studies and economics. So data, love geeking out about it.
Yeah.
And then with science is I have my master's of science in medical cannabis now. And there is that the frustration we've spoken about, that people not understanding what the plant can do, the cannabis plant, but that's a big conversation to have.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing the shift. And we are in November of 2021. We have 38 states, U.S. states, currently have some version of a medical cannabis program, along with the District of Columbia. We have over 20 countries across the globe that have a medical cannabis, some sort of medical cannabis program. Um, and you yourself, with the experience that you've had globally, you're now have been working internationally, as well as the story that I'd like to dive into a bit more of your experience in the States. But speaking first to the US industry, why is it so important for the industry to self-regulate itself
Oh my goodness.
before federal legalization, to make that clear?
Oh, okay. So that's definitely a mouthful there. It does all come down to data. It does all come down to education, and it comes down to consistency, in my opinion. Right now, where the states are, there's so much compartmentalization of the industry and what's going on across region to region. You have, multiple states that are now full force adult use, totally different regulatory framework, totally different marketing, product offering, form factors, things are just different. Then you have your medicinal based states where, there's definitely caps on THC limits, there's caps on what you can access and what types of form factors you're actually prescribed. So there's a bit more, I would say, tightness around a medical market.
Mhm.
And then you get into your hemp only states, which they're, producing for CBD specifically, or,
Mhm.
hemp biomass for other purposes. And, there's just so much going on within the states that, as a federal, like if I were President Biden or whoever, I would be confused. I wouldn't really know what that legalization would look like across the board for all 50 states. So I think self-regulation is going to be quite important, just on the state level, once they're able to look at standardization of testing, what those limits should be comparable to the data that we now have over 20 years now,
Mhm.
versus early on in the green rush, we really just didn't have that data. So we had to pull on other industries and look at limits of food and foodstuffs that really weren't comparable. So I think we're in a great place in the states to where now a lot of those things are starting to be identified at the state level. So then the next step is going to be, how do you translate this state's model to this state so that there's consistency? Because you're going to have consistency in this product. It's consumed by a human, so it has to be consistent in the quality and what's being delivered. So I think that's the next level up. And
Mhm.
then I think that would give a pretty good benchmark for federal legalization to say, okay, this is working. We're seeing that there's a great continuity between, all of the different states that are operating with medical, adult, or even, a blanket type of industry. But I do think self-regulation is so important from the standardization piece and how you transfer that from state to state before we can really have that large conversation about how you do it as a country.
Mhm. How many U.S. states have you worked in?
Oh, wow. So, okay, physically, I've worked in three,
Uh-huh.
and by remote, I've worked in an additional four. And then when you talk about education, there's an additional two states.
Uh-huh.
So
I
I've been
see
kind of all over.
9 states, if I'm
Yeah,
doing my
so
math.
9 states.
Okay.
So physically, I've worked in Florida. That's where I got started
Yes.
whenever everything became legal in 2016. I was very lucky to work with one of the first 5 medical marijuana treatment centers.
Uh-huh.
And then I moved on from Florida up into Ohio when they started up their market. They essentially headhunted for talent. And I went up there, and that was a very interesting market, to
Uh-huh.
say the least. Very close to pharma, I would say.
Uh-huh.
And then I moved into North Carolina, which was hemp based. And I was able to really get a flavor for processing hemp. And, there are very big differences there, even though, it is all cannabis, but very different. And when it comes to consulting, I have had the opportunity to consult and work in California and Colorado, Oregon, Massachusetts, and New York and Pennsylvania.
Fantastic. And so, as we've spoken to, reference is that each state has its different set of regulations to the different a list. I was recently doing some work on a project and looking at 5 states and the massive list some states have on qualifying conditions versus others
Yeah.
being extremely limited.
Yeah.
But is so with your work in 9 states and that the need for standardization, are you seeing a couple of states doing a better job of it? You referenced Ohio having a more of a pharma model.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It,
what's
it's Sure. I mean, I do think there are some states that are getting it right. I mean, I'm Florida, well, not native, but I was definitely raised most of my life in Florida. And I do think that market specifically is really blowing up. And they're going to be, in my opinion, on track to be similar to California. I really do. Now, the only difference is, with California, they kind of came out Wild Wild West. We're a pilot program. We're trying to
right?
figure this out. So standardization has come in now and has really hampered a lot of operation and kind of caused that ripple effect. But now I think they're starting to really get their legs about themselves and start to, run. I think Florida had a very different approach to it,
Mhm.
to where they did adopt some limits that were a little bit less tight and stringent, to where you do have a bit more room to play there. But again, the safety and efficacy was still tested. The limits that they were adopting were tested based on FDA limits, for different solvents that you're using, different contaminant levels, and stuff like that. So I do think Florida is somewhere that we should all keep an eye on, because it's definitely a market that's robust at its best right now. When I got started in Florida, like I said, there was the 5 large MMTCs, and now 5 years later, you have many hemp processors. You have research in you got UF, you got FSU doing hemp-based research and cannabinoid research. So
Right,
there's just
right.
so much going on, within Florida, that I think is just so important to keep an eye on.
Yeah, it is a massively sized state.
Yeah,
The residents that are there, the seniors, the largest growing population or demographic for medical cannabis patients, as well as what we're going to see with legalization and with tourism there. So, how about in the global market, where you let's just dive into the difference of what you're seeing in the global market in the EU
yeah,
versus what's going on in the States, and what are some takeaways for regulation? And again, speaking to
yeah,
medical, if we can focus on medical cannabis, that
sure.
the industry in the States should borrow from the EU.
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and I'm just so happy that I have the unique experience to have worked in, the States and also come over here. So now I'm located in the UK currently,
Mhm.
and I'm actively working with, politicians, with lobbyists, to really try to get some industry knowledge and professionals on boards to really help drive the medical cannabis community here,
Mhm.
because in my opinion, I think it's quite prohibitive for entry into this market, specifically for medicinal cannabis. Access is a big, big issue here. I am a patient, and it is difficult for me to get my prescription on time consistently and not have gaps. One of the things I really want to say about that, and why that's such a big deal, is because, if, for myself, I suffer with chronic pain. And I experienced a flare up to where I was literally put down for 4 days in my bed, and I could not get up, and not having the access to my medicine that I needed. Oh my gosh, it was so
Mhm.
horrible. It was really hard. So I do think that that's a huge issue here over in this market, because they did take a very different approach to medicinal cannabis. I do like the approach. Now, in my opinion, the Western Hemisphere did a little bit of, let's open the floodgates and let's bring it back with regulation. The
Uh-huh.
UK is doing it quite different. They're looking at the laws that, in my opinion, are antiquated now, but they're looking at the laws like the Misuse of Drugs Act. And this was something that was drafted years and years ago based on, a lot of stigmas around cannabis. And they took that and started to build their framework around medicinal cannabis and how to regulate that. And it's very stringent. It's highly, highly stringent. You have to have a lot of capital to really produce to the compliance limits that we're held to here in the UK.
Mhm.
Now, kind of pivoting over into the EU is quite interesting. It's very similar to the States in that you do have all these different countries that now have their own regulatory framework. For instance, you have Spain and Portugal that are in my opinion, very similar to adult use states.
Mhm.
And you have Switzerland, which is very similar to a medicinal state. And then you have places like Croatia, Italy, that are more hemp-based only. And then Germany. Germany is a quite interesting place as well because they're not necessarily cultivating the flowers, they're importing their biomass, but they're a huge processor
Mhm.
of oils and different products that are being prescribed. So yeah, it's a different global framework, and I do think the UK has quite a long time to go to really start to increase that access. But there's a lot of people on the ground level that are pushing, specifically Association of Cannabinoid Industry, Center for Medicinal Cannabis. They are active in the forefront of having those conversations with MPs to make sure that we are going to increase this access to the patients.
Yeah, to that, the access to the patients is that I had the opportunity, the pleasure to meet Hannah Deacon a couple of years ago. We were both at a conference, presenting at a conference in Malta, and hosted her on a profile. And so, well familiar with the passion, the advocacy, her tireless effort to make sure that medical cannabis is available to patients, particularly in the UK, with the story of her son Alfie, and
Yeah.
to their story
Yeah.
of here's a little boy seizuring, I don't know if it's hundreds of times a day, but significant impairment because of his epileptic disease, and then finding with what took her to a similar story of finding a way to treat her son, her little
Yeah.
boy, and having to move out of the country to have access to it, getting one of the first of two patients in the UK. My understanding, though, is that it's extremely challenging and extremely expensive to have access to the medicine in the UK.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, it's definitely expensive. You know, when I think about my prescription, I literally think about a mortgage. Essentially, you know, I'm going to pay my monthly mortgage for the medicine that I need. And it's quite difficult, you know, because I feel as if I were on, you know, just a normal, you know, pain medication, there's insurance involved, there's
right,
subsidies
right.
involved to where, you know, I'm able to access it and I'm able to afford it. And that's something that absolutely needs to shift. You know, it's one thing to make it accessible. It's another thing to make it so dang expensive that
Right.
you're just going to turn back to the way you knew.
Right. Yeah, and yeah, I have a colleague in the industry who's in Texas, and she shared Texas is, bit by bit is opening up with
Yeah.
access to medicine, but what the cost, it was a mortgage payment
Yep.
to treat a patient. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
n- Now we spoke about with the pharma model, specifically you said Ohio, and are there parallels with your experience that you've seen as a scientist that we should draw on from the pharmaceutical industry? That I referenced that the future of the medical cannabis industry and exactly where we are today
Mhm.
is the engagement of the knowledge assets of the pharmaceutical industry, the
Mhm.
legacy cannabis industry, certainly the technology industry, and traditional healthcare. So, is it a good thing for us to be looking at the pharmaceutical industry?
You know, I really love this question because I feel as if we can't put ourselves in just one box.
Hmm.
The plant, if you just look at the plant in itself, it's highly unique. It's highly impacted by several environmental factors on its way to making those flowers. So there's just so much variability in the plant itself, in the input that's going into becoming an API. So for me, I definitely think that we have to approach this very similarly to how compliance is starting to shape for the industry. At first, we start looking at GACPs, we start looking at GMPs,
So
and there's,
GACP, I'm going to interrupt you for a
yep,
second. So
that's
GMP,
good
manufacturer
agricultural
practices.
practice. Yep,
Okay, good agriculture.
yep.
Yes.
So we have quite a few standards that definitely are there and
Hmm.
have a lot of meaning to our industry, but I don't think it's a one size fits all. You know, there's parts of good agricultural practices that just don't fit within our industry and how you farm the plant. There's certain aspects of good manufacturing that just don't fit. all the way. So there's this GXP that's now starting to become a norm in compliance for cannabis because it's all encompassing of the codes of this one, the codes of that one, because we're using all of them because of the complexity. Now, when you look at that on, a regulatory framework side, again, I don't think we need to shape ourselves to just do a copy paste of one industry. I think we really need to look into, okay, what about pharma applies directly to how we're working? So like specifically when you're thinking about dosing and just different things like that and the repeatability of the infusions that you're making into the products. That's a huge thing in pharma to where you cannot misdose a product, because that's someone's life. So those types of things, I think, have their place in cannabis, but then they're shaped by the fact that it's a botanical and that it
Right.
will have a variation to it. And because it has that variation and it is, a botanical, we do need to look at some of the more alternative industries that have that sort of mechanism, similar to the wine industry. You're growing grapes. They are going to be variable, but you will have a very a controlled range of what you can expect. So there's just different things like that I think we could draw on. You can draw from alcohol and tobacco, that industry, and what worked well and what didn't. You can look at, like you said, tech and biotech and delivery methods and mechanisms, and medical devices, and how that will work and shape, a patient's consumption. So there's just so much complexity in this industry that I think it's very difficult to say, yes, we can just copy from pharma and keep moving. I think we have to really craft from a few industries.
I mean, spot on. And it is so unique in that being three industries rolled into one, with
Yeah,
agriculture as the cultivation, processing is
yeah.
manufacturing, and then the retail experience is the dispensaries. Um,
Mhm.
let's pull out some of that answer in the conversation there, where the COA, certificate of analysis, and so this is an area that really needs to be have some light shined upon it, is that the
Mhm.
variables where the COAs, what they well, why don't you're the scientist, why don't you explain what is
Sure.
on a COA or in a COA, what the purpose of it, and then the challenges within the industry and particularly to the patients.
Absolutely. This is going to be good prep for me, Jackie, because next week I'm going to be talking to students about COAs and
COAs.
interpretation. So this is great. No, so yeah, certificate of analysis is extremely, extremely important for consumer safety. A consumer, this is going to be your picture, your snapshot of what you're ingesting, what you're consuming. So you're going to want to know what's in it.
Mhm.
So typically your COA is going to have a full panel of analysis. So you have to, characterize the product. So you need to know what the potency levels are of each cannabinoid that's in the product. And then you need to know any contaminants and if there's a presence there. So you're going to see, heavy metals. You're going to see mycotoxins, which are that's a variable of microbials. You're going to see microbials on your COA. You're going to see pesticides on your COA, and then you'll see terpene analysis just for good information of understanding what's in your product. Those are typically the pillars that you're going to look for. Now, the difference in how you interpret those, because not everyone's a scientist, not everyone's ran these pieces of equipment to understand how to interpret them. You will have numbers, and then you'll have those numbers and concentrations up against a limit. I always like to look at the numbers because for me, it'll tell me a trend. I'm looking at data. I want to see, is there anything spiking? Is there anything dropping off and degrading? Yada, yada, yada. And you can only get that from numbers.
Mhm.
Now, you will have COAs that are a little bit more digestible for the consumer since they don't have that background, that will say pass fail. And that's fine, but I always encourage to do your due diligence to just kind of dig into what pass fail means, because you can pass a product for, let's say it had yeast and mold and it had 9,999 colony forming units. It passed because it's one under 10,000, which is my
Mhm.
limit.
Mhm.
So that to me, those numbers mean something because although it's passing, there still could be a bit of a risk there, if I consume this on a
Mhm.
long-term basis, maybe
Mhm.
not acutely, but maybe in the long term. So
Mhm.
I just say that to, be able to really open the eyes and shed the light on why these are so important. And in my opinion, it's just so difficult to see COAs be consistent across batches. That has been just such a huge, it's been an industry pain point, I think, especially from a processing side to be able to release product into the market. And then from a consumer side, for them to have consistency on what they're consuming. So there's definitely a pain point there, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with that, so that there is THC, and this is where one of the divisions between the medical markets or programs and the adult use recreational. I'd say the THC percentages and what a where the recreational consumer is looking for a high THC. Certainly, it is necessary to have those high THC ratios for the patient. But would you speak to and shine a light again? What we're talking about is what these some of these not so cricket cultivators are doing with THC, and with that, what's going on with the labs in the space.
Yeah, so it's really difficult, without having a standard. And this isn't just necessarily a standard that's coming down federally, but just having an industry standard
Mhm.
for how we test, for how we sample, what is considered a representative sample of a batch. Those are things that vary amongst state to state to state to state.
Mhm.
And because of that variability, you're going to have different, results every single time. With the conversation around THC and specifically with the adult use markets, obviously you have patients that need a higher potency. It's just difficult on a processor side to be able to, have a real representative sample of that batch. And so the risk there is that you have this barrier to entry into the market of your product. And if that barrier is, hey, we need to come into the gate 35% THC, 38% THC, I'm, as a processor, going to try to reach that number. I'm going to be producing to that number. And then what happens is you have cherry picking of samples. You have, people who are specifically picking the top colas because they know just from, all of the research that that's where the most concentrated levels of THC are. It's just difficult not having a standard process that is mandated on how you have homogeneity and a representative sample of a batch.
And standard process is what you're speaking to is also where the plant itself recognizing, or the medicine, this is coming from a plant. So there are inherent challenges with that. Another area that I see as a need for standardization is the naming
Oh,
and
yes.
of the products. And I think what your thoughts are on this, but where I think the impact of what adding to the stigma against the plant as a medicine is naming your medicine Pink Kush,
Yeah.
or having a product line um, or a brand named Cookies. And where I am based in Maryland, and when Cookies came into Maryland and the packaging, where one of the regulations pretty much consistent across all markets is that the packaging is not to mislead or for a child. If a child is old enough to read Cookies, well, wow, what's in here? Let me have at it.
Yes. Oh,
So
my son would be all over that.
yeah, and I mean, we're laughing about it, but with
Oh, it's true.
children are not just little adult bodies. I mean, if
Yeah,
access overdose of THC, cannabis, cannabinoids can be really very, very dangerous to children.
absolutely.
So in any event, what do you think of what should the industry do is there an opportunity to standardize the naming of cultivars? What do you have to
Yes.
say?
Yes, I think there is. And, before jumping the pond, I didn't think so because of the fact that we have just so much truncation, with adult use, what's acceptable, what's marketable, and then medicinal communities. And, you have the historical names, you the Pink Kush, the Skywalker OG, the da 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 da. And there is connection, I think, to those names for the cannabis culture, for people who may have been, consuming underneath the, behind the scenes.
Right,
This was what they were used to. This is how they identified the cultivars that worked for them. So
right.
I think we're in a period of evolution to where we're now coming out of that phase and really starting to understand that, okay, now you have medicinal markets to where, my mother who's going as a patient in Florida, she doesn't necessarily resonate with pink kush. She doesn't understand that naming convention. She's coming from, typical pharmaceuticals and transitioning over. So
Mhm.
I think that the UK has actually really done a great job with this. And I wish I could find one of my cups because I could show you, but they've done a great job to where you have your prescription, and
Mhm.
your prescription cultivar is, headband OG or whatever it is, but then it actually has its medicinal name, which is Aurora Pedanios 20 to 1 or
Mhm.
something like that. So it's like a mix, because then that way, if I was a part of that culture and that was how I connected to that cultivar, then quickly I can say, oh, that's the one that definitely works for my pain at night. But then now I'm transitioning my mindset and brain to that top label that says Pedianos 20 to 1. So I think that's the evolution that's going to take. It's going to be essentially like a co-branding, if you will, with a
Yeah,
medicinal
yeah.
name with the cultural name, and then eventually shift into what will be adopted by the industry as a whole globally, I think.
Right. I mean, is this analogous to a generic name for a pharmaceutical product?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. The last question that I have for you is your thoughts on the push for descheduling or rescheduling cannabis. Again, just that briefly is that cannabis is scheduled by the DEA as a Schedule One drug, meaning that it has a high likelihood for addiction with no medical benefit. And here we are with a multi-billion-dollar industry where very clearly in studies ongoing that yes, indeed, there is a medical benefit to using medical cannabis. So,
Yeah.
with that big question, is what do you think is the best avenue for the next steps?
Oh man, that definitely is a heavy question,
Yeah.
because I just don't think there's enough education at the
Mhm.
legislative level to really make an informed decision about that.
Mhm.
Now, can we just make a decision as a country? Absolutely. We could, just say, hey, we're going to deschedule this guy and we're going to figure out where it fits in our framework. Or we're going to reschedule it down to, Schedule 3, and then just kind of look at it from there. I
Mhm.
think that first we have to identify as a country, what is it that we're talking about when we talk about what's actually scheduled? Is it the specific cannabinoids that we're scheduling, or is it the actual cannabis flower itself we're scheduling? I think that's quite important. Specifically, being over here in the UK, they have taken that model with scheduling cannabinoids. So when it comes to being compliant as a CBD oil, you cannot have controlled cannabinoids like THCA, Delta 9, Delta 8, CBN, THCV, all of these different things for whatever the data is to support it. Those are the ones that are scheduled. So I
Mhm.
think on our end, we have to realize and try to identify, are we trying to deschedule or reschedule cannabis, or are we descheduling and rescheduling parts of cannabis and those different cannabinoids? I don't think that's the way. I definitely think we
Mhm.
need to treat it as a whole, as a plant,
Mhm.
because we are extracting pieces to make different APIs, but we have to look at cannabis. And is that a Schedule 1? Does it fit within, this is highly addictive, this is going to cause no medical benefits to you? And to me, that answer has been proven. That answer has been proven that yes, it has therapeutic benefits.
Mhm.
No, it's not highly addictive. And that, I think, is where we can finally decide to reschedule or deschedule. And from my own perspective, I don't necessarily know if rescheduling is the best way or descheduling. I do kind of think I like to ease into things. I like to kind of stress test before you just
Mhm.
open up that gate. So, in that sense, I would personally rather a rescheduling from an informed place.
Mhm.
And then look at what does descheduling look like for the community, and how will we regulate and police that, and just all the different factors that come along with it.
Yeah, I'm 100% in agreement with you. Is that I refer to the industry still having training wheels on.
Yes.
Certainly,
Oh, that's such a good thing.
certainly the people that are the lack of education that who is reviewing the laws, policies, regulations that impact millions of cannabis patients. Yeah, that and that the industry professionals, the particularly those people that are treating, whether treating patients or the clinicians themselves, as well as the scientists like yourself, that know so much about the plant and what it can do, what it cannot do, and to be at the table making these laws that impact,
Oh, absolutely. I think
public
it's so
welfare.
important.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, we do have to, as industry professionals, I think it's our job to really partner and marry with our, politicians, with our legislators that are drafting these laws, because, we're in the industry day to day. These challenges are affecting us, and I'm watching certain companies really strive, to fight those challenges and obstacles in a very compliant way. But then there's other companies that don't necessarily have that level of compliance or even that mindset. They're just looking at the dollars they can make, and they'll
right.
find loopholes in those regulations. So I think it's quite important that, industry professionals are approached by legislators and politicians to really shape a community that's going to help everybody, because I think that's why we started this industry in the first place. It was to help people,
Right.
and to help people in a way that wasn't going to be addictive or, lethal, or just any of those things that we have seen, from alternative medicines.
Yeah. Well, and that wraps us up. So this was, thank you so much for your time today, Alicia, and
Absolutely.
so much to talk about as you
Yeah.
preface this entire conversation with. So looking forward to our next conversation, and one in particular that we had off camera was what it's like for women in the industry. So we're gonna continue that
Yes.
conversation and have it on a platform that will have some other women in the professional women in the industry sharing their experiences and what the industry needs to move forward to support everybody in the industry, no matter gender or race. So again, many
Absolutely.
thanks, and look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jackie, for having me. It's always a pleasure. Thank
Thank
you.
you.